Meet Amanda. Amanda is a 21-year-old student at the University of Utah.
Amanda has been dating their girlfriend for 6 years now, and unfortunately has experienced bias against their sexual orientation.
Sexual orientation bias is a predisposition toward an individual or a group based on their sexuality.
I came out when I was in high school, and I learned that people had started gossiping about me. I realized that even my best friends had started to treat me differently.
Many people throughout history have also experienced bias against their sexuality.
Homosexuality has been documented in every known civilization. Many civilizations were accepting of bisexuality and homosexuality. In ancient Greece and Rome, there were many cases of both men and women being bisexual. Many indigenous cultures were accepting as well, such as Native Americans and Pacific Islanders. With Western colonization came the spread of bias against sexual orientation. This bias was fueled by faith. In the Bible, homosexuality is prohibited.
In France, during the 13th century, men would be burned alive for homosexual behavior. In England, they would be hung. In North America in 1566 was the first documented case of somebody being sentenced to death for being gay. In the late 1800s, scientists began to try to further understand sexuality. Many European scientists, including Sigmund Freud, believed that homosexuality could be cured. This would pave the way for later attempted treatment with lobotomy, shock therapy, and drugs. As Hitler rose to power in the 1930s, there was an immense decrease in sexual tolerance in Germany. Approximately 15,000 homosexuals were sent to concentration camps. In America, an example of intolerance was in the 1950s. Many homosexuals were jailed or forced to be sterilized with chemical castration.
With the rise of the gay political movement in the 1960s, the condemnation of homosexuality as wrong came under increasing scrutiny. The term homophobia, coined by George Weinberg, describes individual anti-gay attitudes and behaviors. It implies that this prejudice is more of a psychopathology rather than a socially informed prejudice. In contrast, the term heterosexism emerged around the same time, which describes a system in which homosexuality is societally viewed as inferior to heterosexuality. Finally, in 1973, the American Psychiatric Association dropped homosexuality as a psychiatric diagnosis, increasing shame on society for harboring negative attitudes towards homosexuals. Gregory M. Herrick from the University of California, Davis recommends the term sexual prejudice to refer to all negative attitudes based on sexual orientation, whether the target is homosexual, bisexual, or heterosexual. However, such prejudice is almost always directed at those who engage in homosexual behavior. It has been found that those who are expected to have stronger biases against homosexuals are those who are less likely to have had personal contact with lesbians or gays, are more likely to have resided in areas where negative attitudes are the norm, such as the southern United States, are likely to be older and less well educated, are more likely to be religious, are more likely to express traditional restrictive attitudes about sex roles, and are more likely to manifest high levels of authoritarianism and related personality characteristics. However, the decades leading up to the 2000s saw a decrease in the percentage of people with starkly negative attitudes towards homosexuals, whereas at least 2/3 of respondents to the General Social Survey considered homosexual behavior always wrong in the 70s, only 56% felt this way by 1996. Before transitioning into modern day's opinions towards sexual orientation, let's take a closer look at the neurobiology of these biases. There are two main types of biases, implicit and explicit. Explicit biases are those that one knows they hold to be true, are aware of, and may openly state they exist. Implicit biases are those one is not consciously aware of, but that affect their behaviors and actions towards a particular group. Recent research has taken an interest in implicit biases for their large influence on one's daily behaviors. The Implicit Association Test, or I8T, was created to measure such biases by measuring the time it takes for one to associate two concepts. In regards to measuring biases of sexual orientation, one is asked to associate different symbols and words about gay and straight people with words characterized as either good or bad. This test relies on the assumption that associations made less readily are less interconnected concepts in our brains and thus reveal bias. Overall, the majority of individuals who have taken this IAT demonstrate some preference for straight people compared to gay people. However, upon further analysis in which these results were divided among test takers' own sexual orientations, it was found that heterosexual and bisexual people had significantly stronger preferences for heterosexuals. Gay respondents significantly preferred homosexuals, and heterosexual respondents held a stronger preference for their own sexual orientation than gay respondents. These results from the IAT are considered behavioral results, in that they are a measure of one's external reactions. One way to gain more insight into the cognitive processes that take place during the IAT is to measure neuroelectric activity. Neuroelectric activity occurs continuously during the completion of a task and is measured in the form of event-related brain potentials, or ERPs. ERPs enable researchers to more precisely examine the cognitive processing that occurs during an IAT. A study done by Williams and Thomanson in 2010 examined the effects of compatible and incompatible conditions of a sexual orientation group bias IAT on numerous early and late ERP components, including the N1, P2, N400, and late positive potential, or LPP. Compatible conditions included gay negative and straight positive associations, whereas incompatible conditions included gay positive and straight negative associations. Findings indicated no large differences in the early components across conditions of the IAT, such as N1 and P2. However, the N400 and LPP measurements demonstrated statistically significant differences in amplitudes between incompatible and compatible trials. Previous research describes the N400 as an area indicating semantic incongruency, or a lack of equivalence in meaning. Thus, having larger amplitudes in this region reinforces the notion that associating gay concepts with positive ones and straight concepts with negative ones is harder for the brain to do, and that our neural activities can reflect biased attitudes. Furthermore, amplitudes in the LPP were larger in compatible trials, reflecting previous studies that associate the LPP with emotional congruency, particularly in frontal and central sites of the brain. In comparing behavior and neuroelectric measures, researchers found a curvilinear relationship. As a participant's bias increases from no bias to moderate, there is an increasing level of congruency between compatible and incompatible associations. But as their bias increases from moderate to high, there is a decreasing level of congruency between compatible and incompatible associations. There is no clear explanation for this curvilinear phenomenon, but this demonstrates that the cognitive processes involved in implicit biases are multifaceted, and that more research is needed to elucidate the reasoning of such activity.
Many parts of the brain hold potential for future research in sexual bias. The amygdala, seen here in blue, is an almond-shaped gray matter structure located in the frontal region of the temporal lobe. In the study by Phelps et al., the differences in amygdala activity of white participants when viewing black and white faces was measured via fMRI. These results indicated a significant correlation between amygdala activity and IAT results regarding racial bias. Similar results could be expected of participants who view an outgroup of their own sexual orientation. Brain activity in the fusiform gyrus, seen here in teal, may differ between sexual and racial bias because it is not possible to accurately tell someone's sexual orientation from their appearance. Previous studies involving empathy indicate that an individual will have decreased activity in the left anterior insula if they know somebody has a different sexual orientation. Furthermore, there could be activation in the left anterior insula if you are observing someone with the same sexual orientation experience pain. This could be correlated to oxytocin levels because previous studies have shown that oxytocin actually builds in group empathy. Additional studies involving empathy indicate that there could be similar activation patterns in other regions, such as the anterior cingulate cortex, seen here in the right of the colored area, and the supplementary motor cortex. Because sexual prejudice is becoming less socially acceptable, we predict that people with bias against sexual orientation would have their rostral anterior cingulate cortex activated by the social norm of acceptance toward sexual orientation in the situation. The orbital frontal cortex, seen here in blue, is likely involved in correcting one's behavior. The dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, seen here in purple, would likely show activation patterns that could potentially predict choosing a more socially acceptable response. Past experiments allude to the caudate, seen here in pink, being involved in individuals trusting others with the same orientation as they are when making a decision. Lastly, stereotypes of people with certain sexual orientations are likely to occur in the temporal lobe.
These studies regarding activation of brain areas in relation to people's perceptions toward LGBT people have helped us to better understand the neural explanation for why these biases exist, but that doesn't mean that bias has disappeared from society. LGBT people continue to face discrimination in our society, such as that experienced by Amanda. Bullying is extremely prevalent in the lives of LGBT youth. In fact, over 90% of LGBT youth report some sort of bullying. 92.7% reported verbal bullying, 44.7% reported physical bullying, and 89.5% reported social and relational bullying. In fact, LGBT youth are twice as likely to be bullied as their heterosexual peers, and they're also more likely to both think about and commit suicide. However, it's not just bullying itself that's the issue, but also the other problems bullying leads to. Youth who are bullied are more likely to engage in risky behaviors, have depression and anxiety, and have low self-esteem. Making the impact even worse, the consequences of bullying among LGBT youth are even more profound than the consequences of bullying among non-LGBT youth. Another way in which this bias manifests itself in society is through laws. Same-sex marriage has been legal for 3 years thanks to a Supreme Court ruling on June 26, 2015. However, 4 of the 9 Supreme Court justices dissented on this ruling, and there are still other laws that prevent LGBT people from truly having equal rights. One such example of this is the gay and trans panic defense. According to the LGBT Bar Association, this defense asks a jury to find that a victim's sexual orientation or gender identity is to blame for the defendant's excessively violent reaction. The perpetrator claims that the victim's sexual orientation or gender identity not only explains, but excuses their loss of self-control and subsequent assault of an LGBT individual. While California and Illinois have banned these offenses, they are still legal in their 48 remaining states. Additionally, the Trump administration is making it easier for medical providers to discriminate against LGBT people, a group that the Obama administration specifically protected from discrimination in the Affordable Care Act. In a survey of LGBT people who had visited a doctor within the past year, 8% said a doctor refused to see them, 7% said their doctor refused to recognize their same-sex partner, and 9% said their doctor used harsh or abusive language. In today's society, there has been an emergence of fluidity in sexuality, and thus language awareness and the ways in which words are used are of great importance as to not offend or discriminate against others' sexuality. The Committee on Lesbian and Gay Concerns has considered issues of heterosexual bias in language since it was founded in 1980. CLGC has continued to revise their document, Avoiding Heterosexual Bias in Language, and because no universal agreement exists on terminology, and because language and culture continually change, one needs to be open to adapting their language within the social climate. For example, the terms gay as an adjective and gay persons as a noun have been used to refer to both males and females. However, these terms may be ambiguous in reference because readers who are used to the term lesbian and gay may assume that gay refers to men only. Thus, it is preferable to use gay or gay persons only when prior reference has specified the gender composition of the term. This correct usage of language and refraining from negative associations with terms relating to homosexuality extends to the classroom. Sexual orientation bias is prone to develop during childhood and adolescence, as many of our beliefs and values about the world develop during this time. Thus, maintaining high standards of language use early on is crucial to the prevention of sexual orientation bias. In addition, studies show that people are more likely to be biased against other sexual orientations if they have minimal close contacts or relationships with people of counter-stereotypical exemplars. Thus, to reduce bias, the organization Advocates for Youth recommends to insert oneself into environments where there are others of different sexual orientations than one's own, and remind oneself that everyone has a right to be treated with dignity and respect. From a neurobiological standpoint, many studies have shown that slow-wave sleep plays a dominant role in depotentiation and the remapping of synaptic networks that could lead to debiasing and therefore help combat sexual orientation bias. Although all of the aforementioned methods to fight sexual orientation bias demonstrate great advancements in science and our social understanding of this bias, more resources, energy, and time will need to be put towards such efforts to elucidate remaining questions.